One of the most utopian ideas in capitalism is this romantic idea of the small entrepreneur. Because all these right-wingers, especially libertarians, but this applies to other people as well, they say, well, what we have now isn't real capitalism. That explains all of our problems. Because you point out that capitalism is not democratic because the rich control the politicians. So that's an obvious explanation of how it's not democratic. Well, they're like, well, this is not real capitalism, you see. Although they don't really explain how that stops the rich, or yeah, stops the rich from controlling politicians. But they're like, so this is not real capitalism. This is actually crony capitalism. That's the word they love to use, crony capitalism, or corporatism, or something like that, big government socialism or something. They say that if there's government regulations, if the government is somehow connected to the corporations, so that the corporations own the politicians, then that's not real capitalism. They say that Nazi Germany wasn't real capitalism because it was fascism. It was economically capitalist, but because it was fascist, they say that that's not real capitalism. Now, let me just demonstrate to you the absurdity of this. And I've never really understood this with this idea that big corporations control everything, and that big corporations become monopolies, which then subvert competition. How do you stop that from happening? You cannot. How do you, like, you literally cannot, but how do you actually do that? Well, people try to stop it by having government regulation, which says you cannot have a monopoly. Now, of course, it doesn't really work, because even though, like, if there's one or two huge corporations, they're not doing anything illegal, they don't have a cartel, but, you know, if they just win in the competition and everyone else goes bankrupt, then they are a monopoly. There's no, it's not illegal, you cannot legislate against it, but it just happens, and it happens naturally in capitalism. Because in capitalism, the capital has a strong tendency to centralize, and it has been centralizing since its earliest history, and it cannot be reversed. Small businesses compete, some of them win and some of them lose. The small corporations go bankrupt and the big grow bigger, and then they compete, and then the same happens, they grow even bigger and the others go bankrupt, resulting in massive multinational corporations which you know, compete, and then they even fuse together and have all kinds of things like that. So this idea that when we have these big Wall Street bankers controlling everything, and when we have these huge corporations dominating the market, that's not real capitalism, because real capitalism is like the classic old school laissez-faire capitalism where there's like one factory versus another factory. You can never get back to that. It's impossible. How do you suggest we do that? Like, do we just take all the big corporations and then split them into pieces again? Well, what is going to happen? After a little bit of time goes by, like 100 years, they'll be centralized again, just by the competition itself. Competition itself has this tendency to create monopolies, which is, you know, an interesting contradiction of capitalism. And this idea that you should stop rich people from influencing politics because that's, and then you know, a corporation owns the politicians, then that particular corporation gets beneficial treatment, beneficial legislation. They say that's not real capitalism. Well, how do you stop that? Do you ban rich people from donating to political campaigns? No, you don't. I mean, you fuckers would never do that. Even though that would be the correct thing to do what Cuba did. Like, say that nobody can donate any money to politicians at all. Obviously, they wouldn't agree to that, and that would never be accepted by, even if the population wanted it, the capitalists wouldn't want it, so it wouldn't work. And then this idea that, like, what is real capitalism? Real capitalism, as described by libertarians, has never existed and will never exist. Okay, we had the laissez-faire capitalism back in the day, but libertarians don't think that was real capitalism. Well, some of them maybe do, but not all of them. They want a capitalism that is democratic, which is impossible. They want a capitalism which doesn't have government regulations, which is impossible. Capitalism itself needs the state to protect it from itself and from the oppressed people. And then they want a capitalism where capital doesn't centralize, which is even more impossible, because that's literally one of the basic laws of capitalism, that capital centralizes. You cannot stop it from centralizing. This idea that like not real capitalism is ridiculous to me. These people are like, fascism is not capitalism, because capitalism is this very specific thing that has never existed other than in my head. No, you dumb shits. Capitalism means private ownership of the means of production, where owning capital gets you money. That's what it means. Now, modern imperialist capitalism, the sort of monopoly capitalism that exists these days, is one of the most common forms of capitalism. It's not the only form of capitalism, but it's one of the most common forms. Fascism is another pretty common form of capitalism. They're all economically capitalist. I don't understand why libertarians even feel the need to label anything that is actually really existing capitalism, why they need to label that not real capitalism, and then they need to have this idea of so-called real capitalism, which has never even existed. Why don't you guys just call your shit like anarcho-capitalism or libertarian capitalism or something? Why do you need to call it capitalism and then act like actual capitalism is not capitalism? Because it's just confusing the terms unnecessarily. Capitalism has a concrete definition which actual capitalism meets. Your hypothetical utopian shit has never even existed. So, yeah.